Here we have a picture of some 18-day-old birds in a 53 by 600 foot broiler house. And the question is, are these birds evenly distributed from one end of the house to the other? When we look up towards the tunnel doors, you can see the birds look a little bit thicker up there than they do here in the middle of the house. Now, when we look on the off-brooding end, the birds look pretty evenly distributed on this end of the house. But the question is, are the birds evenly distributed from one end to the other? Just looking at the birds, it can be difficult to tell. What we need is a quantitative measure that allows us to determine exactly how many birds are in each end of the house. And the best way to do that is by installing two water meters, one for the brooding end, one for the non-brooding end, where we can keep up with the water consumption on each end of the house, which will give us some idea of the density of the birds in each end of the house. These water meters are connected to the controller. On this particular day, the birds drank about 600 gallons up to this point of the day, but 377 on the brooding end, only 214 on the non-brooding end. And if we assume that each bird is drinking about the same amount of water, you can see that we have a density difference between the two ends of the house. The birds were placed at approximately a square foot per bird, and we do some simple math based on the water consumption. We can pretty much say that 64% of the birds are on the brooding end and only 6% of the birds are on the non-brooding end. Twice the number of birds on the brooding end as the non-brooding end. We have water meters here that show us the flow rate at this point in time, and we're looking at on the brooding end 0.6, on the non-brooding end about 0.34 gallons per minute. This is a graph of minute-to-minute water consumption over the first 9 days. You can see the birds were turned out around August 28th as the water consumption on the non-brooding end went from 0 up to about 0.1 gallons per minute. Now hopefully what we'd see is the water usage between the two ends would equalize after 3 or 4 days. But this was not the case. You can see that there was a big difference in water consumption starting when we turned out all the way up until day 18. And we can look closely at day 7 and 18 and actually see how much of a difference there is in water consumption. That the birds on the brooding end are drinking about twice that of the birds on the non-brooding end. We can do a little more math and come up with what the density of the birds in each end of the house are, where the brooding end, based on the water consumption, they're about 0.78 square foot per bird, and on the non-brooding end, they're about 1.38 square foot per bird. So big difference in density. And what makes it worse is if you actually look closely again up at the brooding end, you can see there are actually a lot more birds up near the tunnel doors than there are towards the middle of the house. Study after study has shown that when you have a big difference in density, there's an increased likelihood of heat stress, especially for those that are on the crowded end of the house. We're going to have reduced bird weights, increased feed conversions, increased condensations, because when the birds get tightly packed together, they're more likely to have scratches. We're going to have some poor bird size uniformity, with the high density end being lighter than the low density end. We're going to have increased likelihood of caked litter on the brooding end, because if there's a lot more birds there, there's a lot more manure going into the litter on that end of the house. We're going to have reduced house temperature uniformity, because there's the difference in bird heat between the two ends of the house will be significant. More birds, more heat on one end of the house, which will make that end of the house warmer. Last but not least, we're going to tend to have higher heating cost, as that one end of the house could actually be calling for cooling and the other end of the house calling for heating, because there's so much of a difference in the pounds of birds on each end of the house. This problem can be simply avoided by making sure after you let the birds out that they're evenly distributed before putting up migration fences. And again, the best way to do this is install two water meters, one for the brooding end, one for the non-brooding end. When the water consumption is equal on both ends of the house, put up your fences, and you pretty much know that you're starting off with an equal number of birds on each end of the house.